Well, good morning to our Professor Antonella, and good morning to our guest and to the people who are watching us in our channel. Today is our second day of our symposium, so we are going to start with the theory of what can we learn from classical political economy. We have our Professor Antonella from Italy. So we are giving her the speech. Yes, Professor, you can start.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, everything is all right. We are hearing you well.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm honored, and it is a pleasure to be in this symposium. I heard yesterday very interesting talks, and I'm sure there will be more interesting talks in these days, more sessions. So it is a big initiative. I'm very happy to be part of it. And I will talk about this issue that you see here, the theory of output from a classical political economy perspective. So I will try to be quick because my speech covers quite a lot of material, but there is also this, I was lucky because yesterday I heard some speeches, especially the seminar by Professor Roncaglia and by Professor Kurz, who covered part of the material that I wanted to talk about. So I'm very lucky because I can be quick on these issues that have been very well explained by them. So this is the synthesis of my speech. I will start from the basics and just say, explain how classical economic policy is a different system of thought with respect to the dominant mainstream neoclassical system of thought, and what are the main differences, which I will especially describe, focusing on three themes, which are the question of scarcity versus reproducibility, which was already dealt with by Alessandro Roncaglia, and also the question of the separate versus simultaneous determination of prices and quantities that again were quickly referred to both by Professor Kurz and Professor Roncaglia, and the question of the socially determined versus naturally determined rule of distribution. So these are basics of the classical theory, which are extremely relevant for the theory of output, how I will try to show. And so I will describe the main characteristics and main implications of a theory of output, which is firmly based on classical political economy. I will try to talk about policy implication because I think that they are very, they may be very interesting, although of course I will try treat them in a general and maybe quick way, but I will try especially to address at the end of the speech, if there is time, two relevant policy issues. One that has to do with the problem of global warming and ecological economics, and the ecological problem, let's say, and the other, which is the current policy response to the pandemic crisis. These are very big problems, these very big challenges. I think that the theoretical structure of classical political economy may prove relevant also in this respect, to give us some indication of how to address these problems and how to operate. But let's start from the beginning. So when Piero Sraffa started the study of economic theory in the 20s, there was only one approach that dominated the analysis of value and distribution. This was the marginalist or neoclassical approach. in which relative prices are determined by the demand and supply of commodities, and also the distributive variables, wages, profits, and are determined by the demand and supply of the productive services of factors of production. So distribution is a part of the value problem, let's say. This supply and demand apparatus at the time was regarded as the only scientific economic theory, and Ricardo and the classical economists were considered at most as imperfect precursors of modern economics. So it was a big effort on the part of Sraffa to discover the classical political economy as a completely alternative point of view, a completely alternative analytical framework, which had been submerged and forgotten. And so here we see again the fundamental role of the history of thought that Alessandro Roncaglia was stressing yesterday, because this capability of Sraffa of studying the past, but also studying the past, putting in context what he read, was fundamental in the rediscovery of this alternative theoretical approach. So he showed that there was a break and not continuity between the classical and the neoclassical approach, and that the demand and supply explanation of value had replaced a previous explanation which was completely different. According to this different explanation, which was proper, for example, to Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, the value of commodities depends on the technical and social conditions on their reproduction, not on the supply demand that in the classical approach may affect only the day-by-day market prices, while theory deals with natural or normal prices, which are the instrument to study prices and make sense of their endless movement. If we look at the price equations, we may say that these are, in a sense, a common ground between the classical and neoclassical approach. These price equations are written in a very simple form, just with two commodities, with capital as entirely circulating, a series of simplifications that allow us to write them in a very simple form. But what do these equations tell us? They simply state the necessary equality between price and cost, where cost includes the integration of used up capital and its normal remuneration. These price equations are based on the assumption of competition, which imposes both the law of one price and equalizes the rate of profit across the different sectors. So these equations are, let's say, common ground between the two theories, but they are interpreted in a very different way. In the classical, in the classical approach, first of all, these price equations are specified for a particular output, for particular output levels, which are given. If they are written in terms of unit coefficients, as I wrote them before, they specify an unnecessary assumption of constant returns, which is absolutely not necessary, as Sraffa takes pains to show in the classical approach. And this is maybe related to the question that was discussed yesterday of the photograph of the system. So the conditions of production that we are studying are specific to a particular set of output levels. How these equations are solved. In the classical approach, the real wage is given, the real wage, or let's say a distributive variable, and it's given by social and historical circumstances. So price equations are sufficient by themselves to determine relative prices and the rate of profit. And they, in a sense, visualize what Garegnani called the core of classical analysis. Prices reflect the technical and social conditions of production and the rule of competition that equalizes rates of profit across different sectors. Profit emerges as a residual, and normal prices are those that ensure reproduction or reproducibility more precisely of the system and distribute the surplus according to the distributive rule. In the neoclassical approach, these price equations are necessary but are not sufficient to determine prices. Distribution depends also on the demand and supply of the services of factors on their respective markets. So price equations are a part of a more complex system. Prices cannot be determined until also the other following equations are added to the system: demand and supply equalities for goods and demand and supply equalities for factors of production. And these depend, both of them, on prices, on distribution, so the prices of the productive factors, on exogenous consumer preferences, and also on factor endowments. This implies that a different rule of the determination of prices operates, which is the rule of demand and supply. And the role of prices in neoclassical theory, prices of both factors and goods, is to coordinate the use of arbitrary scarce endowments of factors to satisfy arbitrary consumer preferences. So two different sets of arbitrary exogenous variables have to be coordinated, which may happen thanks to the substitutability among factors, which plays, as everybody knows, an essential role in this analytical structure. Sorry, I think that I did something wrong with my slides. Yes. Sorry, I went at the end of the presentation. I try to start again. Please tell me if there is any problem in seeing my slides.
No problem, Professor.
Okay. Sorry, but I pressed some wrong key on my computer. So this is very quick because we don't need to review everything, because yesterday was very clearly stated. But there are, of course, enormous difference between neoclassical theory and classical theory thanks to this different analytical structure. So the result is that in neoclassical theory we have simultaneous and interdependent determination of prices as quantities, while in classical theory we have independent determination of quantities and prices. That neoclassical theory of value has a wide scope because it aims at the interconnected determination of all relevant economic magnitudes simultaneously, while classical theory of value has a limited scope because it determines just one set of variables, which are relative prices and the rate of profit, given the rule of distribution, given real wage, and given quantities. Also, we have that consumer preferences have a role in determining prices, an essential role in neoclassical theory, and no role in classical theory. That the determination of distributive variables is symmetric in neoclassical theory and asymmetric in classical theory. And also that in neoclassical theory, we have only two types of economic magnitudes: the ultimate data of the system of equations and the endogenous variables, on the other hand. While in classical theory, we can envisage a third type of magnitudes, which Garegnani called the intermediate data, And these intermediate data are variables that play the role of exogenous variables in some parts of the theory. For example, the data of the core of analysis, which are the real wage and the levels of output, and may be studied in other parts of the theory, so are not ultimate, but just intermediate data in other parts of the theory in which they become endogenous to other determinants, of course. So let's say now the implications of classical analysis. This is what I will develop also later, but the implications are the paradigm of scarcity as opposed to the paradigm of reproducibility. In the classical approach, relative prices are not determined by the demand and supply equality. So they are not indexes of scarcity because they do not have to clear the markets. But they are fixed, are determined once the outputs are given. So this has an essential implication for the theory of output, because this implies that neoclassical prices already imply full employment in their very definition, because equilibrium prices in neoclassical theory are those prices that equate demand and supply. And so, for example, the prices of factors of production equate demand and supply of factors of production, so that underutilization of these factors of production is a disequilibrium phenomenon. And this is implicit in the very definition of prices and, of course, in the mechanisms that bring the system to equilibrium. And this implication implies, of course, that full employment is a necessary consequence, a necessary feature of the equilibrium and the neoclassical equilibrium, while this is not true in classical analysis. The second and very related implication of classical analysis is that since given output levels, we may have a different level of real wage that implies different prices, there is a sort of independence, a functional independence between output levels and distribution. So there is no unique relationship between prices and quantities, no unique relationship between quantities and distribution. For the theory of output, this implies that there is openness of the theoretical structure and the possibility of combining the same determination of prices with different theories of output. And this is the basis, the logical, the analytical basis for the Sraffa-Keynes synthesis, because it allows to use the theory of value distribution of the classical economists to combine it with a theory of output, which was, of course, elaborated later, proposed later by Keynes, but which is compatible, analytically compatible, even if some, not all, but some of the classical economists, notably Ricardo, had a different theory of output and also even believed in this law. And there is a third implication, which is the arbitrariness of distribution. Arbitrariness means that there is no necessary equilibrium value of the distributive variables. There is what we can call a theoretical indeterminacy. And this implies that social forces have a fundamental role in determining distribution. So social forces, relationship between the different classes are not mere imperfections, or interfering force, but are the basic determinants of the economic equilibrium. Now, I want to dwell just a little bit on the first point, which is the scarcity versus reproducibility paradigms. Ricardo was an opponent of the early theories of value based on demand and supply. Of course, at his time, neoclassical theory did not exist, marginalism did not exist, but he criticized some other theories, some early theories of demand and supply that started from the idea that scarcity was the general principle, the general basis determining value of goods. These early theories of demand and supply, they're especially treated in the principles in the in chapter 30, but of course also in other parts of Ricardo's works, were not always fully spelled out theories. Analytically, they were a bit rough. They had no clear distinction, usually, between the analysis of value of a single commodity and the general principle of value. They regarded the utility as a qualitative prerequisite of economic goods, while scarcity was the quantitative determinant of exchange value, especially interesting the analysis by Bharadwaj. Relative prices was seen as determined as an outright ratio between two quantities, the quantity demanded and the quantity available. There was no idea of demand and supply as functions of the price, as will be later in neoclassical analysis, but it was a rough structure, analytical structure in which demand was regarded as expressing the desire of consumers to buy a certain good, and supply as the available quantity brought to the market. But the limited availability of the supply was essential in determining its value. So scarcity, limited availability of the commodity, was the founding principle of value. And this idea comes originally from agricultural society, from the idea of a given harvest. Of course, there are also other I am very quick here, other expression of these early theories of value based on demand and supply, for example, Jean-Baptiste and also Malthus, but they were a bit different, a little more complex than this early theory, even if they, of course, were not marginal analysis, and they both were involved in debates with Ricardo on value. But both discussing with these economists and criticizing the early theories, Ricardo is very clear in his critique to the scarcity principle. And his critique is based on the idea that in the long period, supply adjusts to any effectual demand. This is the same idea that we can find also in Smith, although Ricardo was critical of Smith on some other essential points in the theory of value. But I will not read all this quotation, but it is a very famous quotation at the very beginning of the principles. And it shows that, according to Ricardo, scarcity is usually irrelevant because it is also relevant for a limited number of commodities. For example, scarce book and coins, wines of a peculiar quality, and so on, very peculiar commodities which cannot be reproducible. But normally, the theory of value generally deals with those commodities, such commodities, as can be increased in quantity by the exertion of human industry, and on the production which competition operates without restraint. So it is the competition of capitals that implies that production and so supply of these of commodities is elastic to demand in the long period in order to equalize the rate of profits, that also ensures that the conditions of production are the only essential determinant of value. This implies that Ricardo focuses on reproducibility, and reproducibility is typical of an industrial society. So there is also, let's say, a kind of evolution with respect to the previous theories of scarcity. The only cases in which scarcity applies is, as I said, for non-reproducible commodities, and also in the case of artificial scarcity induced by monopoly. This also shows the same attitude, and it is taken from the essay on profits, but I will not read it. So it is interesting that later, at the end of the 19th century, when neoclassical theory was born, although it was a very refined and highly formalized framework of thought, so not comparable with the early theory of scarcity, but in this respect, with the role of scarcity, it represents, let's say, a step back towards earlier conception. Because scarcity becomes again in neoclassical theory the universal principle of value, although it is in neoclassical theory not an attribute of goods, which are recognized as reproducible, but an attribute of factors of production, which are given in limited quantity. Here there is a quotation by Kassa, which shows, in my view, very clearly this conception. He says that a commodity is reproducible only means, of course, that its scarcity can be ascribed to the absolute scarcity from the viewpoint of production of other commodities. These absolutely scarce commodities we call the primary factors of production. So scarcity of goods is endogenous, but availability of factors is exogenous. And of course, scarcity is endogenous also because it is relative scarcity and it depends on the preferences of consumer. And also a very important feature, analytical feature of neoclassical theory is that in the end, it treats capital as scarce resources, or at least it tries to treat capital as scarce resources because it assimilates capital to the other factors of production. And I think that in this treatment, there is the root of all the analytical problems that neoclassical theory has with respect to capital. So also this synthesis is very quick, and I'm sorry that in order to be quick, maybe I go superficially over some characteristics of these theories, which are very well known and debated in a lot of very important works. So we all know that marginalism, neoclassical theory, which represents a deep change of perspective with respect to the previous classical political economy standpoint, is based on the choices of rational and undifferentiated individual as the basic determinants of economic phenomena, that individuals have independent preferences and market is the only form of interaction between individuals. The equilibrium prices, as we know, are the prices that equate demand and supply. Exchange is prioritary over production. The conception of the productive process is linear rather than circular, and this again was raised yesterday by Alessandro Roncaglia. It goes from original factors to consumption goods. Unhindered market forces give rise to optimal outcomes. It is an historic conception. Social classes play no role. Institutions either are regarded as imperfections or have to be explained, as happens in some new institutional economics, as the product of market forces. So now it's not possible to deal with this big question, which is how marginalism was so successful, being a theoretical structure that I described as even going back to previous conceptions of value. But of course, this is again a very big issue that has been dealt with in very important works. I only resume some of the causes that have been raised in the literature, and some are related to the analytical difficulties of the classical approach, and of course, which have to do with the labor theory of value, while, especially in its beginning, the marginalist approach was apparently immune to analytical contradictions, although of course it was not true. And also there was this emphasis on measurability of individual motivations and choices, which made economics, that changed its name in economics at the time, as into let's say an exact science. So the ambition of economics was that of having a theoretical status similar to that of natural sciences. And also there was an increased use of mathematics that contributed to the creation of a profession of economists, and also maybe from the point of view of the political implications, it offered an harmonic conception of distribution as opposed to the conflict view of distribution proper to classical economists. And this might be more reassuring from the point of view of the social order. But all these reasons made, the structure, the success of marginalist principles also implied that this structure, this framework of thought has become dominant in all the subsequent period and is still dominant. Because we have now that this basic structure of thought has become so basic in economics that it is usually not recognized as the expression of a particular theoretical approach, but as the language of economics itself. And we have that even macroeconomic modeling in the mainstream is currently based on the same framework, the individual maximizing utility framework, from which we can extract all aggregate economic laws and property of the system and the policy prescriptions. And we have even extreme forms of this, for example, in the DSG models with a single immortal agent. Even if there is a lot of unease about this, many strands of thought, even within the mainstream, criticize a lot of specific hypotheses. But the basic demand and supply apparatus is virtually never challenged. Okay, maybe I will not deal with this because I think that time is running. So what is interesting is to see that this scarcity paradigm actually revealed some basic problems, analytical problems, which is not possible to solve. These fundamental analytical problems were raised at various times during debates within the economic analysis, and in some cases even within the same approach. For example, some early discussion regarding the possibility that substitutability is not present in sufficient degree. We have that variable coefficients are absolutely necessary because substitutability has to be high in order to ensure significant, economically significant equilibrium, but this kind of substitutability, high substitutability, is not always empirically justified. At the same time, there is the possibility that arbitrary data are incompatible with an economically significant equilibrium. For example, there is the possibility that arbitrary data give rise to a mathematical solution which implies negative prices. The theory has no internal mechanisms ensuring that equilibrium prices are such as to allow reproduction of labor. So subsistence is not guaranteed as an automatic outcome of the market process. And the same kind of problem applies to capital goods. The theory does not guarantee reproduction of all capital goods because these are treated like original factors in the theory, not like commodities. In the case of capital, we have that in all the versions, also with marginal product and variable coefficients, it is impossible to know the endowment of capital before knowing distribution. When capital is understood as a single factor in value, it is impossible to draw decreasing demand curves for capital. And yesterday, Professor Kurz very brilliantly referred to the capital controversies, so I don't need to deal with these, but it is clear that these expose fundamental problems of this approach. While on the contrary, the fact that capital is not to be known before in its value amount before knowing distribution is not an analytical problem within classical political economy, within the classical framework, because it does not need to be among the data of the problem. So what these debates show is that the scarcity approach is an internally inconsistent theoretical framework. And this also opens the way to classical analysis as the foundation of a modern economic theory. But what I wanted to especially to deal with is are the implications of classical analysis for the theory of output. I reviewed them before. So we spoke about separate determination of prices and quantities, which does not mean absence of any relations between the two, but the non-existence of a necessary and unequal relationship, and especially no presumption of optimal results of the market mechanism, which also implies, as we will see better later, more room for economic policy. We also saw that distribution depends on a social nature, a rule, not a natural one. And this theoretical indeterminacy of distribution matches the analogous indeterminacy of possible output levels that we have in Keynes' theory, where there is no presumption that the system automatically goes towards a unique equilibrium level of output, which is full employment, as happens in neoclassical analysis. And it's also very important to notice that in classical analysis, there is no emphasis on individual behavior. Of course, it can be studied, but there is no emphasis on it as the founding principle of economic action. in this case, we have a historical conception in which classes, institutions, conflicting interests play a fundamental role. So we saw that the classical theory of value and distribution is analytically open, that price determination in this theory is closed through the use of intermediate data, which are liable, sorry, there is something wrong in my slides, which are liable to be determined in different parts of the theory. So we have a sort of modular and sequential theory instead of a comprehensive and simultaneous determination of prices and quantities. And this structure, this analytical structure that we saw before discussing the role of the price equation, gives extreme importance to all sorts of historical and institutional influences that may affect the determination of such intermediate data. As I said before, institutions are not interferences in the market mechanism, but essential determinants. So let's now go to Keynes. Of course, Keynes was a neoclassical. He was brought up in the Marshallian tradition at a time in which marginalism had gained unchallenged dominance in economics. And he thought it possible to state his own theory of output that denied the tendency to full employment by taking for granted marginalist tools of analysis as, for example, the marginal products. In fact, he had a theory of investment which is based on a decreasing relationship between investment and the rate of interest. But also in his theory of investment, he mixed the innovative elements having to do with conventions, mass psychology, institutions. So it's a complex theory of investment in which we can find two different strata of analysis, let's say. And also in the analysis of the labor market, Keynes used the marginal product of labor. He did not see that there was such a strong connection between this marginalist principle and the necessary tendency to full employment. But he had in his analysis a lot of different elements which can be defined as entirely extraneous to marginalism. Both his method of analysis, which is causal and sequential, as Pasinetti has noted, and of course the principle of effective demand, which contradicts squarely the conclusions of neoclassical analysis. Also his search for a completely exogenous determination of the rate of interest, which he tried to free entirely of any real influence, and in his attitude to define directly macroeconomic relations and magnitudes without aggregating individual behavior, and also no conception in his analysis of the undifferentiated individual agent, because we always see agents operate in the general theory, in the theory of Keynes, as a specific social role. So what we can say is what, in my view, Garegnani summarizes very well in Keynes, the existence of two fundamentally heterogeneous strands of thought, which give rise, in Garegnani's opinion, to an inherently unstable compromise, which have been solved in subsequent economic analysis in two different ways. One is to abandon substantially the principle of effective demand, or at least its implications. And this is the route which has been followed by the neoclassical synthesis, by diffusing Keynes' innovations and makes Keynes' theory into a special case of the traditional theory, which becomes only relevant for the analysis of depressions, and also from the policy point of view, very limited in its use use and scope, while the post-Keynesian schools of thought have solved the dilemma by abandoning the marginalist theory of value and distribution and focusing only on the innovative elements of Keynes' thought. Which means that the marginal theory of distribution has to be replaced by different theory of distribution, which happens in the different post-Keynesian schools through different theories of distribution, but in the classical Keynesian approach, this principle effective demand is built on the classical theory, of value and distribution. So the paradigm of scarcity becomes irrelevant, both for the determination of prices and for the determination of output levels. No mechanisms ensure the tendency to full employment, nor to the natural rate of unemployment. This is based on the critique to the automatic mechanisms of neoclassical theory and also on the non-existence, of course, of any well-behaved demand for capital or for investment. So we can see at the evolution of output in the long period as characterized by high elasticity to aggregate demand, also thanks to the role of the notion of normal capacity utilization as different from full, which allows both downward and upward flexibility in the use of resources. And what is very relevant in this approach is that aggregate demand determines not only utilization of existing resources, but also the creation and destruction of resources, which in the long period become endogenous to the growth of output. So we have these features, independence between distribution and output, which we already reviewed before, the existence of an inverse relationship between real wage and the rate of profit, so the conflict view of distribution, which is fundamental also in the study of growth, and from the methodological point of view, the non-existence of relations of universal validity as regards the interrelationship between output, distribution, because there is a big role for institutional, historical, and the social factors that may affect the economic outcomes. Okay, so we have no convergence towards the normal utilization path, plurality of possible paths of growth, endogeneity of potential growth as dependent in the long term on the evolution of actual output, path dependence, and so strict interconnection between cycle and trend, and no reason and no possibility of representing these the growth paths of the economy in terms of steady growth paths. So we have all these characteristics that, in my opinion, are essential in the development of the classical Keynesian approach, and are strictly related to the classical theory of value and distribution, which is a founding base of this approach. But I would like in the last minutes to go over the policy implication. Of course, again, in a very general discussion. So in this approach, there is no reason to assume that there is any spontaneous tendency of the system to the optimal use of available resources. There is no welfare properties of the position or the paths that the system spontaneously realizes. And also, lacking any tendency to full employment, there is no necessary trade-off between consumption and investment, and no necessary trade-off between public expenditure and private expenditure. But also, since prices have no optimal characteristic, no optimal properties, the state intervention is not necessarily distortionary, because there is no a unique set of prices which is compatible with equilibrium. Also, the fact that we have a theoretical indeterminacy of the growth path in the system gives creates wide scope for policy action. In the first place, demand policy may have both short-run and long-run effects. And this is very relevant, especially as regards the debate with the mainstream, where demand policy are usually considered irrelevant in the long period. Also, of course, we have the different impact of different kinds of public expenditure, different tax structures. We can, for example, study the different multipliers of the different components of public intervention. Another important implication of the classical Keynesian approach is that the structure of the economy can be changed through policy action, again, because the market by itself does not produce optimal results. And so constraint may be removed so that demand policy may be more effective. And these have to be removed through industrial and supply side policy. What is fundamental as a general conclusion of the classical Keynesian approach is that the growth path and the distribution arrangement that market forces tend to realize are the effect of arbitrary circumstances, among which there is the relative power of the different groups of the society. So there is no natural order implicit in economic forces, which implies that market result can be affected by equally arbitrary policies, which might be the result of conscious social choice. So my ambition was to deal with very briefly with a couple of problems. May I go on for 2 minutes more? Well, if they don't reply, maybe yes.
Yes, of
Thank
course.
you.
See?
Thank you. I was checking the time. So
Yes.
I wanted to say something about the ecological problem. And again, I'm sorry that I try to address two big problems in the space of two short speech, and also with my limited competencies. But I think that it is important at least to try to see what a different theoretical paradigm may imply in terms of the vision of the problems, and especially to free the mind of the researcher from the strict consequences and the strict dilemmas that very often come out of the mainstream approach. So I try to explain what I mean, and I'm not an expert of ecological economics, so I'm sorry if I treat this theme in a very general manner. So I said before that in classical analysis, scarcity is not the founding and general principle of value, and also that in Keynesian analysis, the system does not tend to full employment generally, which implies that resources cannot be regarded as scarce. So scarcity is not relevant in this approach that I tried to describe. But of course, for example, in classical analysis, scarcity might present itself as a specific problem. So not the general and founding principle of value, of course, but for example, Ricardo addressed the problem of scarcity, talking about land and analyzing the rent of land. And also, as we said, as we saw before, talking about some very specific commodities. Now, the ecological problem is usually defined in terms of scarcity. So maybe we could think that the classical Keynesian approach is irrelevant or may find itself in difficulty in dealing with this problem. But the question is whether the problem is correctly defined, and I have no answers, no precise answers. I have more questions. So pollution. Is pollution a question of scarcity of clean air and water, or maybe it should be defined as the production of dirty air and water as byproducts of the production of other commodities? So is it mainly a problem of consumers' choices among the different products that may have a different ecological impact, or is it a production problem? So should production or consumption be regulated more in order to avoid the negative implications of production for the environment? And more than this, is the route to degrowth unavoidable? Or maybe is this solution strictly connected to the scarcity theoretical framework, and so maybe not the right analytical definition of the problem. Of course, this ecological problem is a great challenge that cannot have easy solutions, but it is possible that the scarcity paradigm probably creates false trade-offs, or at least does not allow positing the problem correctly. Yesterday, Alessandro Roncaglia mentioned the fact that even for scarce and non-reproducible resources such as oil, incessant technical progress has continuously moved on the physical limit of production. Can something similar happen for the ecological problem? Maybe there is the need to regulate production more than consumption, but also we can see in passing that consumer preferences are not exogenous, since they can be changed and motivated by the need to address the ecological problem. So maybe there is a need for a kind of economic policy that targets specific sectors and production, because the unregulated market has no optimal properties. And this implies that the need to govern the market has also to do with the content of production, which must fall under the scrutiny of collective choices. So very quick remarks, but to say that maybe the current problems may be posited in a different way within the classical approach. I wanted to say something also to the pandemic crisis, but I see that I used all the time that I had, so maybe I'd better stop here, because I don't want to use the time of the next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Antonella, for this good presentation and good share of the knowledge that you shared with us. As for right now, we didn't get any questions. If we got the questions from our channel, we will transfer it to you as possible as we can, and at that time you can answer us according to through my and time. Well, I will give the speech to Dr. Sema.
There is no question on YouTube. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you again for organizing this and for having me.
And next time we will meet in Turkey.